Imagine walking into your favorite grocery store tomorrow and seeing prices for everyday items, milk, eggs, bread, just all skyrocketing overnight. Or trying to refill a prescription only to discover that your generic medication is suddenly twice as expensive. All of this could become a reality within moments because of the sweeping tariff plans proposed by Donald Trump.
Guess who's back? Back again. Donald's back to make it great again. Make it again. Yeah. Donnie's back. Donnie's back. Donnie's back.
But what exactly are these tariffs? How do they work? And how will they impact your wallet, most importantly, your business and the economy at large? Let's break it all down. Before diving into the specifics of Trump's proposal, let me just reiterate and say that I am neither for or against this, but I want to do the best I can to provide you the best detailed research of what this could mean for all of us, as a proposal like this could shake our futures like none of us have ever thought of in our entire lives. So now, let's start with the basics. What are tariffs, and why are they such a hot button issue? Tariffs are essentially taxes placed on imported goods. Think of it like this: when a company in the US buys products or raw materials from another country, whether it's cars, steel, electronics, or even food, they have to pay an additional fee to bring those goods into the US. That fee, the tariff, is typically calculated as a percentage of the item's value. For example, let's say an American company imports steel from Canada, and the tariff rate is 10%. If the steel costs $1,000, that the company would have to pay an extra $100 in tariffs just to bring it into the US. Now, the purpose of this isn't just to collect money, it's actually a tool that governments use to make foreign goods more expensive. The idea is that when higher prices on imports will encourage people and businesses to buy domestically and make products here instead. Sounds simple enough, right? But here's where things get kind of complicated. Those extra costs don't just disappear, they're often passed down to us, the consumers. If a business has to pay more for the goods they import, they'll likely just increase the price of the final product to make up for it. Let's look at a real-world example. So just imagine a grocery store that imports fruits like bananas or avocados from countries in Central or South America. If tariffs are applied to those imports, the cost of those fruits at the checkout counter will likely go up. Similarly, if a car manufacturer imports parts from overseas, the final price of the car you buy could be higher because of the added cost of the tariffs. This is where the debate about tariffs heats up. On one hand, tariffs are designed to protect domestic industries by making it cheaper to produce goods within the country. In theory, this should create jobs and boost the local economy. For instance, if foreign steel becomes more expensive because of the tariffs, American steelmakers might see a surge in demand for their products. That could lead to more factories opening up, more jobs being created, and a stronger domestic industry overall. On the other hand, there's a downside. By making imports more expensive, tariffs can cause prices for everyday goods to rise, impacting consumers directly. This is especially true in industries where the US doesn't produce enough of certain goods to meet the demand. Take clothing, for example. Many of the garments sold in the US are made overseas because labor is cheaper. If those imports are taxed heavily, clothing prices at retail stores could increase dramatically, hitting your wallet harder than you might expect. Historically, tariffs have been a double-edged sword. In some cases, they're successfully protected fledgling industries. For instance, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tariffs helped US manufacturers compete with established European producers. But tariffs have also backfired. During the Great Depression, Congress passed the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s, which raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, leading to a global trade war that economists believe worsened the economic downturn. Fast forward to today, and tariffs remain a controversial topic. Supporters argue they're necessary to protect American jobs, punish unfair trade practices, and reduce reliance on foreign countries like China. Critics, however, point out that they can lead to higher prices, strained international relations, and unintended consequences for businesses and consumers alike. Tariffs aren't just abstract economic tools, they have real consequences for what we pay, how businesses operate, and how the economy functions as a whole. Whether you notice it at the grocery store, in the cost of a new car, or in your next tech purchase, tariffs can impact everyone directly or indirectly. And that brings us back to Trump's proposed plan. With a sweeping 10% tariff on all imports, he's looking to reshape how America interacts with the global economy. But will it deliver the benefits he's promising, or will it come with significant downsides? Let's break it down. Now let's talk about Trump's latest proposal, a universal 10% tariff on all imports. This isn't just targeted at specific products like steel or aluminum, as we saw during the first term. Instead, this would apply across the board to everything entering the United States. Electronics, clothing, cars, furniture, food, medicine, you name it. If it's made abroad and shipped here, it would be hit with this tax. To put this in perspective, the US imported over $3 trillion worth of goods in 2023, according to government data. A 10% tariff on all of that would amount to an additional $300 billion in taxes, that's with a B, paid by the businesses and consumers who rely on those products. So what's the motivation behind this bold and sweeping move? Trump has pitched these tariffs as part of his America First economic strategy. His primary argument is that while these tariffs will discourage companies from outsourcing manufacturing to other countries and instead incentivize them to produce goods right here in the US. For example, if it suddenly becomes more expensive to import cars and car parts from Mexico or tech components from China, Trump believes that American companies will have no choice but to relocate their factories back to the US. In his words, this would create a boom in domestic manufacturing. It would revitalize industries that have long been struggling or outsourced. He's framed this plan as a way to protect American workers and level the playing field, especially with countries like China, which he claims have taken advantage of the US through unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation. In fact, Trump's campaign and his supporters often point to past successes, with tariffs as proof that this approach works. For example, during his first term, he targeted tariffs on Chinese goods, helped force the country to the negotiating table, resulting in the Phase 1 trade deal of 2020. While critics noted that deal didn't go far enough, Trump argues it proved that the US can wield tariffs effectively as a bargaining chip in global trade negotiations. But then, here's the twist. This time, the proposal is much broader. In scope, a universal 10% tariff wouldn't just target a single country or industry. It would affect every single import, from cheap textiles made in Bangladesh to high-tech semiconductor chips produced in Taiwan. And while Trump says this will bolster American manufacturing, many experts warn that such a sweeping tariff could come with significant and unintended consequences. Economists and trade analysts are deeply divided over Trump's plan. On one side, supporters of the tariffs believe this bold move could finally fix some of the very long-standing trade imbalances that have harmed US industries for decades. For example, by making foreign goods more expensive, they argue American made alternatives will become more competitive. This could boost demand for domestic products and create more factory jobs in industries like automotive steel and electronics. Proponents also claim that reducing dependence on imports will strengthen the US economy resilience. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how vulnerable global supply chains can truly be, with shortages of critical items like medical supplies and semiconductors disrupting the economy. Tariffs, they argue, could encourage more self-reliance and reduce the risk of future disruptions. However, critics warn that the broad scope of this tariff could backfire, and in a huge way. Consumer prices could spike. Many economists predict that a universal tariff would trigger higher prices across the board, from groceries to electronics to cars. The cost of imported goods would rise sharply, and what companies would likely pass those costs on to consumers. This would act like a hidden tax on American households, especially middle and lower income families who are already feeling the effects of inflation. According to recent analysis by the CNBC, a universal tariff could increase the average family's annual expenses by at least $1,000 to $1,500, depending on how much their spending relies on imported goods. For families already struggling to make ends meet, this could be a significant burden. Small businesses could struggle. The impact wouldn't just be felt by consumers. Many small businesses, medium-sized businesses, rely on imported parts or materials, and they could see their operating costs just skyrocket. Take, for example, a furniture maker in North Carolina that sources wood from Canada. A 10% tariff on those imports could squeeze their profit margins or force them to raise prices, potentially driving customers away. Global retaliation risks are also a thing. That's another concern, is the other countries could retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on American exports. This could hurt US farmers, manufacturers, and other industries that rely heavily on selling goods overseas. During Trump's first term, we saw this play out when China responded to US tariffs by imposing its own American soybeans, pork, and other products, leading to significant losses for US farmers. If a universal tariff sparks a new wave of global trade wars, it could disrupt international markets and hurt the very industries Trump is trying to protect. Complicated production chains. Lastly, critics argue that Trump's plan oversimplifies how modern manufacturing works. In today's global economy, many products are made using complex international supply chains. For example, a smartphone might be designed in California, assembled in China, and include components made in Japan, South Korea, and even Germany. Tariffs on those imports would raise the cost of production, potentially making US companies less competitive in the global markets. So how does Trump justify the plan? Despite these warnings, Trump remains confident in his proposal. He argues that the past administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have failed to prioritize American workers and industries. By implementing a universal tariff, he believes that the US can reclaim its position as a manufacturing powerhouse and reduce its reliance on foreign goods, particularly from countries like China. Trump has also dismissed concerns about higher prices, saying that the long-term benefits like increased job opportunities and a stronger domestic economy outweigh the short-term costs. In speeches and interviews, he's doubled down on his belief that Americans are willing to pay a little bit more for goods if it means supporting American workers and businesses. So what's the bottom line? Trump's tariff plan is ambitious and unprecedented. It promises to shake up America's role in the global economy, potentially bringing back jobs and industries that have been outsourced for decades. But as we'll explore in the next segment, the real question is, will this plan deliver on those promises, or will it end up causing more harm than good? The impact on Americans. So what does a 10% tariff on everything mean? Well, if you're someone who buys groceries, fills prescriptions, or shops for clothes, or uses a smartphone, and let's face it, that's pretty much everybody. These tariffs could hit you right where it hurts, your wallet. Let's break it down. Grocery prices could skyrocket. One of the most immediate and noticeable impacts of the proposed tariffs could be on food prices. According to a report by CBS News, it found that imports are some of the most vulnerable to price increases under Trump's plan. Many of the fruits, vegetables, and other staples that we see on grocery store shelves aren't grown domestically. Instead, they're actually imported from countries like Mexico, Chile, and Costa Rica, where warmer climates allow for year-round production. So here's an example. Avocados, a staple for guacamole lovers, are primarily imported from Mexico. In fact, nearly 90% of avocados sold in the US come from across the southern border. If a 10% tariff is slapped on those imports, grocery stores are almost certain to pass that cost along to you, the consumer. What does that look like? Well, that $1.50 avocado you're used to buying might now cost $1.65 or more. It's not just luxury produce, items like avocados that will be affected. Everyday essentials like bananas from Central America, berries from South America, or even coffee beans from countries like Colombia and Brazil could see price hikes. For families already struggling with higher grocery bills due to inflation, these increases could make it even harder to put food on the table. What about domestically grown products? While buying local might seem like a solution, it's not as simple as it sounds. Many domestic farmers rely on imported fertilizers, pesticides, and farming equipment to grow their crops. If those imports are taxed, the higher costs of production could trickle down into the price of US grown goods as well. The end result, a trip to the grocery store could soon feel like a bigger financial burden for millions of American families, and higher costs for generic medications. The impact of tariffs doesn't stop at the dinner table. It could also hit the pharmacy. A report from NBC News highlights how Trump's tariff proposal could significantly increase the cost of generic medications, which are used by millions of Americans to treat everyday issues like high blood pressure to diabetes. Why would medication prices go up, you may ask? Many generic drugs are manufactured overseas, believe it or not, in countries like India and China, where lower labor and production costs make it possible to keep prices affordable. In fact, more than 40% of generic drugs sold in the US are actually imported. By adding a 10% tariff to those imports, manufacturers would face higher production costs, and those costs would likely be passed on to who else but the consumers. For people who rely on medications to manage chronic conditions, even a small price increase can have a big impact. Let's say you pay $30 per month for a generic medication today. After a tariff, that price could climb to $33 or more. Over time, that extra cost adds up, especially for families who rely on multiple prescriptions. For low-income families or seniors on fixed incomes, these price hikes could mean having to choose between buying medication and covering other essential expenses like rent or utilities, or even food. While there are US-based pharmaceutical manufacturers, their capacity to meet the demand for all generic drugs is limited, meaning we can't easily just switch to domestic production to avoid these higher costs. Electronics and clothing prices could also be on the rise. Those are the two other major spending categories, which is electronics and clothing. These industries are heavily reliant on imports, and under Trump's tariff plan, they could become significantly more expensive. electronics. According to a report from ABC News, most of the tech devices we use daily, smartphones, laptops, televisions, are manufactured overseas. A typical smartphone, for example, might be designed in California, assembled in China, and included components made in South Korea, Japan, and Germany. Even a small tariff on those imports could cause prices to jump significantly. So let's take Apple as an example. In recent years, Apple has faced pressure to bring more manufacturing to the US. But for now, the vast majority of its products are assembled abroad. If a 10% tariff were added to iPhones, the company would face a tough choice: raise prices even further, cut profits, or absorb the costs by reducing spending on other areas like research and development. If Apple raises prices, the cost of a new iPhone, already over $1,000 for some models, could climb even higher, making it less accessible for the average consumer. And it's not just phones, laptops, gaming, consoles, smart TVs, and other electronic devices would also likely see similar price increases. Now, clothing. The clothing industry could also feel the squeeze. Many major brand manufacturers manufacture their products in countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and China, where labor costs are significantly lower than here in the US. A 10% tariff on imported garments would likely lead to higher retail prices for everything from your favorite pair of jeans to winter jackets and sneakers. For example, a $50 sweater made overseas might now cost $55. While that might not sound like a big difference, it adds up when you're buying a full wardrobe for a family. Middle and lower income households who rely on affordable imported clothing would feel this impact the most. Even domestic clothing brands might not be immune. Many American companies import fabrics, zippers, buttons, and a host of other raw materials to assemble their products here in the US. If those inputs become more expensive due to the tariffs, the final product will cost more too, of course. So the ripple effects. The higher prices in these categories, groceries, medications, electronics, and clothing, don't just hit individual wallets, they also affect spending habits. Economists warn that if tariffs cause prices to rise significantly, consumers may just start cutting back on any kind of discretionary spending, which could ripple through the entire economy. If families have to spend more on food and clothing, they may choose to just skip eating out at restaurants, delay upgrading their phones, or cancel vacations altogether. This reduction in consumer spending could hurt businesses in other sectors, leading to slower economic growth overall. In essence, while the tariffs are aimed to create jobs and boost domestic production, they may come with a hidden cost that lands squarely on the shoulders of everyday Americans. Whether it's your grocery bill, your prescription costs, or the price tag on your next smartphone, these tariffs could fundamentally change how much you pay for the things you need and you use every single day. So next, let's dive into how Trump's tariffs could impact businesses, both large and small, operations that rely on imports to stay competitive. Could this plan force them to bring jobs back to the US, or will it lead to even more challenges? So let's explore. It's not just consumers who would feel the effects of Trump's proposed tariffs. American businesses, large and small, would also face significant challenges, from manufacturers who rely on imported materials to farmers who depend on foreign markets. A universal 10% tariff could ripple across nearly every single industry. So let's break down the potential impacts. Let's start with manufacturers and small businesses. The first to feel the pinch would likely be manufacturers and small businesses, especially those that rely on imported parts, raw materials, or finished products to run their operations. According to USA Today, a universal 10% tariff could drive the cost of doing business for countless companies, many of which already operate on a very thin profit margin. Take, for example, a furniture maker in North Carolina. While the chairs and tables they sell might be assembled locally, many of their materials, like wood, from Canada, or textiles from India are imported, a 10% tariff on those imports could force the business to make some very tough decisions. They might have to raise their prices, which risks driving customers to their competitors, or they could absorb the extra costs, which would shrink their already narrow profit margins. Either option could spell trouble for small operations trying to compete in a crowded marketplace. The challenge becomes even more severe in industries where imported components are critical and irreplaceable. For example, a small electronics company that assembles devices in the US might import circuit boards or microchips from China. These components often have no domestic alternative, meaning that company would have no choice but to pay the tariff and pass the cost onto the consumers. For small businesses, the stakes are even higher. Unlike larger corporations, which may have the resources to absorb temporary cost increases, small businesses often operate on a very, very tight budget with very little room for error. Higher costs could push them to the brink, forcing layoffs, reducing production, or even shutting their doors entirely. Even companies that don't directly import materials could feel the squeeze. Higher costs throughout the supply chain would eventually trickle down. It's going to happen. For instance, a restaurant might face higher prices for imported ingredients like olive oil or seafood, forcing them to raise menu prices. The result would be fewer customers and tighter margins. Next, let's talk about agricultural exports that could suffer. So it's not just manufacturers and small businesses that could feel the effects of Trump's tariffs. US farmers could face significant challenges as well, especially if foreign governments retaliate with tariffs of their very own. This isn't just speculation, it's a scenario that's played out before. During Trump's first term, his administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, which prompted China to retaliate with tariffs on US agricultural exports, including soybeans, pork, and corn. According to PBS, this trade war dealt a devastating blow to American farmers, many of whom lost access to key export markets and were forced to sell their crops at even lower prices. The US government eventually spent billions in subsidies to offset these losses that the farmers faced. But the damage to farmers' livelihoods and long-term business relationships was significant. That 10% tariff could spark a similar round of retaliatory tariffs, particularly from major trading partners like China, the European Union, and Canada. For US farmers, this could mean losing access to crucial export markets, which currently account for a very significant portion of their revenue. Take soybeans. For example, the US is one of the world's largest soybean exporters, with much of the crop going to China. If China imposes a new tariff on US soybeans in response to Trump's proposal, Chinese buyers may turn other suppliers like Brazil, which could permanently damage the US's share of that global market of soybeans. The same risk applies to other products like beef, pork, wheat, dairy, but it's not just retaliation that could hurt farmers. Many agricultural operations rely on imported machinery, fertilizer, and other inputs to run their farms efficiently. That 10% tariff on these goods could increase the cost of farming itself, making it harder for US farmers to compete both domestically here in the US and internationally. Next, supply chain disruptions across industries. One of the biggest challenges for US businesses under Trump's tariff plan would be the disruption of global supply chains. In today's interconnected world, most industries rely on a very, very complex web of suppliers and manufacturers located across multiple countries. Tariffs, especially on a universal scale, could throw a wrench into the system. Take the automotive industry. For instance, American automakers like Ford and General Motors may assemble cars in the US, but many of the parts, such as engines, transmissions, and electronics, are actually imported from countries like Mexico, Canada, and Japan. So a universal tariff would raise the cost of these parts, increasing the price of manufacturing these cars in the US. Some automakers might absorb these costs, reducing profits, but likely not. While most of them will probably just pass them right on to the consumers, potentially reducing sales. Even industries that rely heavily on domestic labor, like construction, could face higher costs. Many construction materials, steel, aluminum, and even tools, are imported. If tariffs increase the cost of these imports, it could drive up the price of building homes, offices, and infrastructure projects. That in turn could slow down construction activity and hurt even more related industries, from real estate to interior design. So, potential for job losses as well. Ironically, while Trump's tariffs are designed to bring back jobs to the US, some experts warn that they could have the opposite effect in certain industries. It may not be all. When businesses face higher costs due to tariffs, they often look for ways to cut expenses. And that often means their workforce. For example, during Trump's first term, several manufacturers laid off workers or closed factories altogether due to the rising costs from tariffs on steel and aluminum. So if that 10% universal tariff leads to similar cost pressures, industries that rely on imports could see widespread layoffs, particularly in sectors like retail, manufacturing, and agriculture. Small businesses in particular may be forced to make very tough decisions about their staffing. A local clothing retailer that imports products from overseas might not be able to afford both higher inventory costs and its current workforce. For the employees, the result could be reduced hours, furloughs, or even permanent job loss. It's a very balancing act for businesses. In the end, Trump's tariffs create a difficult balancing act for businesses. On one hand, they're designed to incentivize companies to bring manufacturing back to the US, but on the other hand, they create higher costs and new challenges that could hurt businesses in the short term and, in some cases, the long term as well. The big question is, will the potential benefits like revitalized domestic industries and reduced dependence on foreign imports outweigh the costs for US businesses? Or will the unintended consequences like layoffs, higher operating costs, and reduced competitiveness tip the scales the other direction? So in the next segment, let's zoom out a little bit more. Let's look at the broader economic consequences of these tariffs and how they could affect everything from inflation to the US's position in the global economy as a whole. The universal 10% tariff wouldn't just affect consumers and businesses. It could have a far-reaching consequence for the entire US economy. Experts say that impact would be complex, and while some industries could see some benefits, others warn that the broader economic fallout could outweigh those gains. Let's break down 3 key areas of concern. So, first off is inflation. One of the most immediate effects of a universal tariff could be a surge in inflation, which happens when the overall cost of goods and services in the economy just rise. By design, tariffs make imported products more expensive, and businesses that rely on those imports are likely to just pass that on to the consumers. Over time, this price increase could ripple across the entire economy, driving up the cost of living for everybody. So for example, imagine you're just building a house. Tariffs on imported steel, lumber, and appliances could drive up the construction costs, making it more expensive to buy a home. At the same time, higher prices for essentials like food, clothing, and medicine would leave Americans with less disposable income. This combination of rising costs and shrinking purchasing power could place significant strain on households, especially those that are already struggling. But the ripple effects don't stop there. As inflation rises, the Federal Reserve would likely step in to try to control it by raising interest rates. While this is a standard tool for managing inflation, it could have serious consequences for everyday Americans. Mortgages and housing, higher interest rates would make borrowing more expensive and driving up monthly mortgage payments for home buyers. This could make it harder for families to afford homes, potentially cooling the housing market altogether. car loans, and credit cards. For anyone financing a car or carrying credit card debt, higher interest rates would mean paying more in interest over time. Business loans. Small businesses that rely on loans to invest in growth or cover operating costs would also face higher borrowing costs, potentially forcing them to scale back operations and increase prices. According to CNBC, a universal tariff combined with inflationary pressures could effectively act as a double tax on consumers. First, in the form of higher prices, and second, in the form of higher borrowing costs. For an economy that has only recently begun recovering from the effects of the pandemic and ongoing inflation, this could stall growth or even tip the US into a recession. Next, we're going to talk about the job market impacts. One of the central promises of Trump's tariff plan is that it will bring back manufacturing to the US. By making imports more expensive, Trump argues that companies will be incentivized to shift production back home here to the US, creating jobs in industries like steel, automotive, and textiles, among many others. While this sounds like a win for American workers, the reality is far more nuanced. First, not all industries would benefit equally. Some manufacturing jobs might return, but many others could be lost during the rising costs of production and materials. During Trump's first term, the targeted tariffs on steel and aluminum caused significant disruptions in industries that relied on those materials. NPR reported that while some steel factories expanded, other manufacturers, like those producing cars, washing machines, and farm equipment, laid off workers because they couldn't afford the higher input costs. The same pattern could repeat under a universal tariff, but on a much larger scale. Industries that rely heavily on global supply chains, such as electronics and retail, might be forced to cut jobs to stay afloat. Even small businesses that don't directly import goods could face challenges as their costs rise, leading to layoffs or reduced hiring. Additionally, it's important to consider the nature of the modern manufacturing jobs. Many factories today rely on advanced robotics and automation, meaning that even if production shifts back here to the US, it may not create as many jobs as hoped. A factory that might have employed 500 workers 20 years ago could now operate with just 50 highly skilled technicians. Finally, the question of retaliatory tariffs. If other countries respond to Trump's plan by imposing tariffs on US goods, American exporters, especially farmers and manufacturers, could lose access to key international markets, and it could lead to further job losses in export-dependent industries, such as agriculture and aerospace. The net result, while some jobs might be created in certain industries, others would likely be lost, leaving the overall impact on employment very unclear and potentially negative. National debt concerns as well. Another critical issue is how Trump's tariff plan could affect the national debt. At first glance, tariffs might seem like a win for government revenue. Businesses pay the tax on the imports, and that money goes directly to federal coffers. In fact, Trump has framed tariffs as a way to generate funds for critical infrastructure projects and reduce the US's reliance on borrowing. However, the reality is more complicated. While tariffs might initially boost government revenue, they could also slow economic growth, ultimately reducing the amount of money the government collects through other channels, such as income taxes and corporate taxes. So here's why. If businesses faced higher costs due to tariffs, they might just cut back on hiring, resulting in fewer jobs and lower wages. This in turn would reduce the amount of income tax revenue that the government collects. Similarly, if consumers spend less because of rising prices, businesses might see lower sales and profits, leading to a decline in corporate tax revenue. Retaliatory tariffs from other countries could hurt US exporters further reducing tax revenues from industries like agriculture and manufacturing. According to economists, a slowdown in economic activity caused by tariffs could offset much of the revenue they generate, leaving the government with little to no net gain, possibly, and potentially a larger national debt. This is especially concerning given the current state of US finances. As of 2024, the national debt has surpassed $33 trillion, and rising interest rates have already increased the cost of servicing that debt. If Trump's tariffs lead to slower economic growth or a recession, it could make it even harder for the US to manage its debt burden, potentially leading to long-term financial instability. It's a very high-stakes gamble. In theory, Trump's universal tariff could deliver economic benefits by reshaping trade relationships, boosting domestic manufacturing, and reducing reliance on foreign goods. But in practice, the plan comes with very significant risks: rising inflation, potential job losses, and worsening national debt. Economists are divided on whether the US economy is strong enough to absorb these shocks. Some argue that the short-term pain is necessary to achieve long-term gains, while others warn that the costs of the plan could far outweigh the benefits. Ultimately, the question is, are the American people and the economy as a whole prepared for the ripple effects of such a sweeping policy? In the next section, we'll explore the political ramifications of Trump's tariff proposal, including how it's dividing public opinion and reshaping the national debate. The debate over Trump's proposed universal 10% tariff isn't just about economics, it's also deeply political, dividing voters, lawmakers, and global leaders alike. For Trump supporters, the plan is a bold and patriotic move, one that puts American workers and industries first, but critics warn that it could harm the very people it's meant to protect by driving up prices, disrupting industries, and destabilizing global trade. So let's unpack how this proposal is being received by the American public, its role in reshaping the national political conversation, and the broader ramifications for the US on the world stage. So first, public opinion. Americans are truly divided. As with many of Trump's policies, his proposed tariffs have sharply divided public opinion. According to polling data from NPR, Americans are split on whether they're willing to support higher tariffs if it means prioritizing domestic jobs and industries. Supporters' perspective. For Trump's base, the tariff proposal is seen as a logical extension of his America First agenda. Many of these supporters live in regions that have been hit hard by decades of factory closures and job losses, particularly in the Rust Belt. In these areas, industries like steel, automotive, manufacturing, and textiles were once the backbone of the local economy. Supporters believe that tariffs will level the playing field by penalizing foreign competitors and forcing companies to bring production back to the US. Trump's promise to rebuild American manufacturing resonates deeply with this audience, who view the tariffs as a necessary step to reclaim industries lost to outsourcing and unfair trade practices. For many, the potential for higher prices on consumer goods is worth that trade-off if it means more jobs and economic security for American workers. Now, the critics' perspective. On the other hand, many Americans, including independents, suburban voters, and some working-class families, are more skeptical. They worry that the immediate financial strain caused by rising prices could outweigh any long-term benefits of the tariffs. With inflation still a concern and wages struggling to keep up with the cost of living, critics argue that higher grocery bills, medication costs, and clothing prices would disproportionately hurt middle and lower income households. Additionally, consumers in urban and suburban areas who are accustomed to affordable goods imported from countries like China, Mexico, and Vietnam may be less willing to accept significant price hikes. Many see the tariff as a regressive policy, one that puts an undue burden on everyday families rather than corporations or foreign governments. There's a growing awareness of trade policy. What's particularly interesting is how Trump's tariff proposal has brought trade policy, a topic that's often viewed as very boring or overly technical, into the national conversation, like this video today. NPR notes that more Americans than ever are paying attention to the impact of global trade on their daily lives, with many questioning where their products truly come from, how supply chains operate, and whether the US should be more self-reliant. While the country remains divided, the debate itself signals a growing awareness of how trade policy intersects with jobs, wages, and economic growth. Now let's talk about congressional tensions, which is a battle over policy. Trump's tariff proposal has also reignited fierce debates in Congress, where lawmakers are once again clashing over the direction of U.S. trade policy. The issue cuts across party lines, with both Democrats and Republicans split between supporters and critics of Trump's plan. Republican divisions. Many Republicans, particularly those aligned with Trump, have rallied behind the tariffs as a way to protect American workers and industries. They argue that the previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have failed to address trade imbalances with countries like China, and that bold action is needed to restore America's competitive edge. However, not all Republicans are on board. Members of the GOP who represent pro-business constituencies, such as Senator Mitt Romney and other moderate conservatives, have expressed concerns that tariffs could actually hurt U.S. companies by raising costs and sparking retaliatory measures from our trading partners. They argue that instead of blanket tariffs, the U.S. should pursue targeted trade agreements that address unfair practices without disrupting our global supply chains. Democratic responses. On the Democratic side of things, the response has been similarly mixed. Progressives, including figures like Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have expressed cautious support for tariffs as a way to curb corporate outsourcing and protect American jobs. However, they have also criticized Trump's plan for failing to address broader issues like labor rights, environmental standards, and income inequality. Meanwhile, centrist Democrats, including those from urban districts, worry that the tariffs would disproportionately hurt working families by driving up prices. They also point to the potential for retaliatory tariffs to harm export-dependent industries, such as agriculture and aerospace, which employ millions of Americans. It's a political lightning rod. The debate has turned Trump's tariff plan into a political lightning rod, with both parties struggling to craft a unified response. This lack of consensus reflects the broader tension between economic nationalism and global trade. A tension that has come to define much of U.S. economic policy in very recent years. International and global implications. Finally, it's impossible to discuss the political ramifications of Trump's tariffs without considering their impact on the global stage. The U.S. has long been a champion of free trade, but Trump's plan marks a sharp departure from this tradition, signaling a more protectionist stance. Reactions from our various trade partners. Major U.S. trading partners, including China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, have already expressed very strong opposition to the tariff proposal. Many view it as a unilateral move that could disrupt international trade and strain diplomatic relations. During Trump's first term, similar tariff measures led to retaliatory tariffs from countries like China, which targeted U.S. agriculture products like whiskey and even iconic brands like Harley-Davidson. If Trump's universal tariff is implemented, it's likely that other countries would once again retaliate, escalating tensions and potentially sparking a new wave of trade wars. Now there's also the impact on U.S. leadership in a global economy. By prioritizing protectionism over multilateral trade agreements, the U.S. risks alienating allies and ceding influence to rival powers like China. For example, if countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa turn to China for trade partnerships, the U.S. could find itself increasingly isolated. On the flip side, Trump supporters argue that the tariffs are a necessary step to reassert America's strength and demand fair treatment from trading partners. They believe that other countries will ultimately respect the U.S. for standing its ground, even if it causes short-term friction. It's a very high-stakes debate. The public and political reaction to Trump's proposed tariffs underscores just how high the stakes truly are. For Trump supporters, the plan represents a bold step toward reshaping America's economy and protecting domestic industries. For his critics, it's a risky gamble that could backfire, hurting the very people it's supposed to help. What's clear is that the tariff debate is as much about values as it is about economics. It forces Americans to confront tough questions. Are higher prices worth the potential for more domestic jobs? Should the U.S. embrace protectionism or continue to champion free trade? And what role should America play in the global economy moving forward? These are all very key questions that need to be explored and to think about. I want to thank you so much for your time, and I recognize this was a very long video, and I really appreciate you sticking through and listening to everything. This is a topic that could affect each and every single one of us. I truly hope that you learned something from everything I covered today. Hopefully the detail was just the right amount of detail for you to truly unpack these large kind of topics. And if you could give me a like and a subscribe, I love making content for you. And I really want to break down these very, very big concepts into something very manageable, something that we can all learn from and recognize how all these decisions that are being made on our behalf are going to affect our day-to-day going forward for the rest of our lives. Tariffs, for example, as you can tell from this entire video, is so crucial. It can change the trajectory of the entire US on a global scale, but also our wallets on a day-to-day. And it's very important that we have an understanding of what's being decided by whomever it is, from the left, from the right, from the middle, whatever it might be. So thank you very much for your time. Don't forget to smash that like button, give me a subscribe, go ahead and follow me, and I'd love to see you back at my next video. Thank you very much.